Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In January of 2008, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology announced the Permanent Drought. Sydney Morning Herald, this drought may never break. Perhaps we should call it our new climate, said the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones. It didn't rain so much in Australia during 2010 and 2011, it actually caused global sea level to drop. Puzzled oceanographers who wondered where the sea level rise went for 18 months now have their answer. It went to Australia. Rain, in effect evaporated ocean, fell in such colossal quantities during the Australian floods of 2010 and 2011 that the world's sea levels actually dropped by as much as 7 millimeters. Undaunted by their previous failures, the Sydney Morning Herald was back at it last spring. Last year was very dry in Australia, and the Sydney Morning Herald said, "Is this the new normal?" And now, a few weeks later, Sydney is flooded with record rainfall. The reality is that Australia has gotten wetter over the last 120 years. There is tremendous year-over-year variability, but the trend has been upward since the beginning of the 20th century. Australia has always had periods of drought, followed by periods of flood, followed by periods of drought. This is the normal climate for Australia. And every time the weather changes, people imagine that the climate is changing. Here's an article from the Brisbane Courier dated January 10, 1871. Imaginary Changes of Climate. 3 consecutive years of drought, while they've stimulated the inventive resources of practical agriculturists, have had the natural effect of calling forth a plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. We have often noticed that in the tabular statements of those compilers of weather records who write to the Times, useful and welcome as their communications are, every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest, windiest, coldest, or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. The situation in 1871 was exactly the same as it is now. People were imagining that the climate was changing, and experts were producing all kinds of fake statistics to back that belief up. Wednesday, March 11, 1846, on the change of climate. That great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia, all testimonies satisfactorily prove. The Aborigines say that the climate has undergone this change since white man came in the country. That's another popular theme in climate superstition, that white men are the cause of it. It's been going on for almost 200 years. This week marks 8 years since The Guardian announced the permanent drought in the United Kingdom. A year later, The Guardian announced that flooding in the United Kingdom in 2012 cost as much as £600 million. The permanent drought is just about to the level of this guy's window. In May of 2016, California Governor Jerry Brown and the New York Times announced the California Permanent Drought. The press was all over this important breaking story. Governor Jerry Brown started building a $100 billion train to nowhere because he was told by climate scientists that that would make it rain. The train didn't get built, but Jerry Brown did leave the state with $100 billion debt for his climate control project. And a few months later, California had their wettest winter on record and they were flooded. California ski areas nearly disappeared beneath the snow. And again last year, California had so much snow that residents of Mammoth had to tunnel their way out. It would be easier to excuse Governor Jerry Brown for making this mistake if it was the first time he did it. But in 1977, Governor Jerry Brown and the New York Times made exactly the same mistake. They said that the California drought was causing a disaster of immeasurable magnitude, and a few months later, California was flooded. You would hope that climate alarmists could learn from their mistakes, but that doesn't usually seem to be possible. There has been no trend in California precipitation since the start of records in 1895. Rainfall is very variable in California. Some years are extremely dry and other years are extremely wet. Now let's take a look at Texas. In 2015, climate fraudster Katherine Hayhoe of Texas Tech University was running around the state warning government officials about the drought. She blamed the drought on 2 of Texas' largest industries, the oil industry and the cattle industry. But 2015 was the wettest year on record in Texas. Most people can tell the difference between drought and the wettest year on record, but Katherine Hayhoe seems to have difficulty with that concept. Like in Australia, the trend in precipitation in Texas has been upward since the end of the 19th century. Catherine Hayhoe has me and all of my followers blocked on Twitter because she doesn't like people pointing out her scams. She also says she won't debate me because I'm too polite and civil. Now let's take a look at the desert Southwest. In 2011, President Clinton's climate advisor Joe Rahm announced the permanent drought in Arizona. But there's been almost no trend in Arizona precipitation since the end of the 19th century. I lived in Arizona from the mid-1970s until the late 1980s and saw some very dry years and some very wet years. I was back in Arizona in the autumn of 2018 when they had their wettest October on record. And a few months later, Flagstaff, Arizona, which is the 8th snowiest city in the United States, had their snowiest day on record. Flagstaff averages 111 inches of snow per year. I was born and raised in New Mexico, where there's been no trend in precipitation since the late 19th century. My parents moved to New Mexico during the driest year on record in 1956, but then it got wetter and wetter for the next 30 years. People who moved to the state during the 1980s thought that wet was the normal for New Mexico, and then when it dried up again, they blamed it on climate change. And this is what Taos Ski Valley looks like this morning. They're buried in very deep snow. Climate is cyclical. We get wet periods followed by dry periods followed by wet periods. But every time there's a dry period, climate scientists determine that it's the new normal. They keep telling us that we're headed into a permanent drought. Kate Marvel is a PhD and she works for NASA, so she must be a really marvelous climate scientist. As hard as they try, though, their propaganda is failing. A new survey in the Australian newspaper shows that only 35% of people blame the recent fires on global warming. 56% of Australians blame the severity of the fires on government's failure to reduce fire risk. Climate alarmism is not working very well for the press, but they remain undaunted by reality. Fox News says extreme weather could cause a massive economic recession like we've never seen before. UN report warns coming climate apartheid will split Earth between those who escape and those who will suffer. Kierkegaard explained the underlying problem. Since boredom advances and boredom is the root of all evil, no wonder then that the world goes backwards, that evil spreads. Climate alarmism is made possible by the fact that people live very comfortable fossil fuel powered lives. If people had to struggle to stay warm and get food, they wouldn't be entertaining themselves with disaster scenarios like the climate apocalypse. There's no basis in reality to anything which climate alarmists believe, but they're bored and they need a horror story to keep themselves entertained. And they get very angry at me and other climate skeptics for disrupting their horror story. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.